Morning, my HS 103 students. This is for Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is week 6, or at least the start of week 6 at at Loyola, sorry. Um, and as a reminder, we are not meeting to Tuesday, October the 11th, 2022. Again, we are not meeting October 11th, 2022, so we are not meeting this Tuesday. I've gotten several emails from students who swear up and down that I didn't tell them what we were doing Tuesday, even though I took time in every class. I made sure to do that in every class I taught, to remind people that we will not be meeting. I've canceled classes for the morning because I do not have classes in the afternoon, and I teach 2 classes in the afternoon at Loyola again on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So we are not meeting tomorrow. Um, there's the inauguration and installment of the new official installment of the new president at Loyola, and there's a mass from 2 to 4:30. So, bottom line is we're not meeting. So just I'm sure that one of you will probably show, or two of you will probably show up to each of the classes I teach in the morning, think that we're meeting, and then send me an email saying, "Where are you, Professor Collins? Are we doing this on Zoom and all this other stuff?" And I'm going to be like, it's in announcements. I made the announcements in class. I put them in announcements in Moodle. I put them in videos back-to-back weeks. No one's listening. So at least the people who should be listening aren't listening. I'm not saying no one's listening. That's too much of a slap. So please pay attention. So this week, we're going to focus mostly on the Great Depression. With some back and forth between the 1920s and the 1930s, and the drumbeat toward World War II, with the war that eventually makes the U.S. the superpower that it remains to this day. So that's bottom line what I'm going to talk about in summarizing the lectures for this week. This is also the week that you all should start reviewing each other's work, in terms of peer review and assessment using the writing rubric I provided at the beginning of week 4 for the writing assignment process. So there are about a quarter of you have not submitted your first drafts for whatever reason, right? Anxiety, just waited to the last minute to do it, even though I asked you not to do that, even though I expected you not to do that, all of it. But the sooner you get it, and the more time your peer will have to actually review it and give you useful feedback so you can do revisions. Otherwise, it kind of defeats the purpose of setting up a process that involves peer review, a sense of independence in terms of your writing, and actually independent thinking on your own that doesn't require me to tell you how to do everything, right? So, this is all important for life and everything else, even though you might not see it as that important. You might see it as nagging burden and the like. But I want you to be able to do the things that really what college is designed to do for you academically, which is to help you think independently, not depend on what just your parents said, or maybe what your church or temple or synagogue or mosque said about something or other, right? Or just, talking points from a political and ideological viewpoint. I want you to be able to think independently of those things. The only way to do that is to do work that allows you to think independently, which requires me not to tell you everything and to pour everything in your head and so on and so forth. And I know some of you are resistant to that, and some of you will probably continue to be resistant to that. But I can resist too, right? Resistance is not futile or futile. So there's that. Trying to think if there's anything of immediate nature that needs to be addressed for this one. Oh, one other thing. More and more, as students have started to ask me more and more questions about content in the course, about the writing assignment, so on and so forth, one of the rules I've set up for my own, personal boundaries is repeatedly violated, which is staying 2 meters away, 6 feet away from me when you ask me a question. Right? Some of you are coming right up to me. Some of you who've been sick, and I know you've been sick, and you've told me, and the university's told me you've been sick, are nevertheless coming up to me as if everything's normal. And I want to answer your questions. I want to address your whatever questions or comments you might have. But I can do it from 6 feet away. I don't need you to be right up next to me to do it. I don't need you to be right in front of me to do it. 6 feet's fine. So please do that, for my own comfort, and quite frankly for yours too. At one point I came with the sniffle glassing. It turned out that I had some minor bacterial infection because of my dog, right? And my sinuses was a sinus infection, right? But I didn't know that 100%. I was pretty sure it wasn't COVID, but it is, it could have been contagious and you wouldn't have known it. Luckily, I wore my masks, right? So just be careful. You don't know. You don't know what people are doing outside of the classroom. I mean, I know what I'm doing. I'm doing everything I can not to catch anything, which is why I don't go to restaurants or hang out and do any of that stuff. But even with that, I can't control everything. So please, please pay attention to what I ask in terms of this. Okay, so that's all of what I wanted to talk about. Before I talk about what we're doing for week 6. Week 6, content-wise, is basically about the Great Depression, its causes, its consequences, FDR, the election of FDR in 1932, and the New Deal, and all of that, right? There's a lot to cover. You can teach an entire course just on the Great Depression, just on the Great Depression and its impact on the U.S. today, right? But I'll just give you a few major talking points. Causes, its consequences, the New Deal, and so on. So, bottom line is, I left you off with the 1920s. In the 1920s, there was so much I didn't cover in the 1920s, like the rise of Puerto Rican migration, not immigration because Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, but migration to the eastern seaboard of the U.S., particularly New York, where you eventually get the term known as New Yorkers because Puerto Ricans eventually come there. I left that out. And talk about Mexican migration into the U.S. in the 1920s. And their forced out migration in the 1930s due to the Great Depression, and talk about that. And then talk about the continuation of the reservation system and and particularly boarding schools in the 1920s, and some debates about what to do about that. The issue about who's white and who isn't white, and coming up with the Supreme Court, I talked about earlier with scientific racism and social darkness. But with that, the rise of things like sterilization, mass sterilization programs in California and New York in the 1920s. There's just a lot I left out, right? So hopefully folks will pick up on that later on in the course when we deal with projects. But on to the 30s. And the main thing to understand about the Great Depression is that the Great Depression does not really start with the crash of the stock market crash of crashes on October 24th and 29th of 1929, right? Because there are multiple crashes, it's not just one. People don't immediately jump out of windows and kill themselves either as a result of the Great Depression. That happens, it does happen. It just doesn't happen literally that day. It happens over the next month, the next several months, the next years, as the economy does not recover from the crash. The factories are starting to close, and more of them start closing. Banks, there are more runs in banks in 1930 than in 1929, and in 1931 than in 1930, and so on, right? But the reasons for the Great Depression are a multitude. Primarily, the fact that, on the one hand, the 49% of people who lived in the rural part of the U.S., the large minority of people, the nearly half of the population that lived outside the cities, were experiencing a depression. A depression or recession, maybe a slight surge in prosperity in the mid-1920s, but by 1926, things had crashed again. And they were mired in a permanent state of depression, of economic depression, from pretty much 1926 through the 1930s and into the 1940s. It's only really once World War II begins in the U.S., as far as U.S. involvement in this is concerned after Pearl Harbor, that the rural economy begins to fully recover, right? And really after World War II. Government subsidies keep things going, but in the meantime, people were losing their farms. 200,000 people in 1926, upwards of 1 million people a year during the 1930s. In Oklahoma, where the term Okies comes from, these people who end up migrating to California and other parts west, more than 1 million people out of the 5 million farmers who are in the state of Oklahoma leave Oklahoma for parts unknown. Most stay, to be sure, but 1 million people lose their farms just in that state alone, to give you some sense of what we're talking about here, some scale of what we're talking about here, right? So this is a economy that's depressed, and when half of your economy is depressed, half the people who live in your country, nearly half, are facing depression anyway, and the other half are basically borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, with for lack of a better way of putting it, to pay for everything from food to electricity to radios to cars to whatever. You can't sustain that, and so the economy crashes with the stock market crash, but that's the part of the economy that was prospering. The remaining part that's prospering crashes. There might have been a recovery if there had been free trade, but rising tariffs under the Smoot-Hartley Act of 1928, and tariffs around the world between the British Empire, the French, the Germans, etc., made it almost impossible to trade with other countries to get your economy out of the depression, which means that you're completely dependent on what's happening domestically. And if people don't have money to buy anything, if banks are closing because they've speculated on everything, and they've loaned out money to large investors, to large borrowers who are not able to pay anything back, then you can't guarantee anybody's bank account. And this is before the FDIC, which was created under FDR, and immediately after he took office in his first 100 days of office in 1933. There was no federal deposit, insurance, commission, whatever it's called. I can't remember the exact terminology now. FDIC. So the result is people's bank accounts weren't guaranteed. And so if you happened to put away $1,500 in a bank account, it was gone. If you put $500 in a bank account, it was gone. So there were constantly runs at banks to make sure that before a savings and loan just suddenly closed, you could get your money out. And that caused panic, that caused riots. People got killed at banks, because they didn't have money that people came in all at once to get, right? People got injured. People ended up in hospitals over this kind of stuff. So, but there are a variety of reasons for this, right? Mostly because the economy that was roaring through the 20s could not sustain itself. You can't have a consumer-based economy with a poverty rate over 50%. And the middle class, it may be at best is 25% of the population, right? Estimates basically put the middle class of the U.S. between 10 and 25% in this period, with the top 10%, of course, being filthy rich. So most people are working poor because there's no welfare system in this country at this point, and they're constantly borrowing for everything. That's not sustainable. when half of and then the majority of those people are living in rural areas and have no access to anything, and are going through deep depression and foreclosures in the first place, that's not sustainable. You can't sustain that. So of course the economy collapses. And by the time you hit 1932, you had an unemployment rate of 25%, which is what your textbooks say. But the true unemployment rate in the United States in this period is actually about 33%, right? Because they're not counting women. Women do work in this period, despite the images of Rosie the Riveter during World War II. A lot of white women work, a lot of white ethnic women, middle class, boss white women, generally speaking, did not work. Of course, affluent white women didn't work. And in most cases, many cases, once a white woman married, they generally don't work. But there are exceptions for white immigrant women. They're working. For black women, 60% of black women are working, right? 40% of married black women aren't, but that's a whole nother stat, right? But there are a lot of women working, so if you take into account the true unemployment rate, it's about 33%. It's not it's not it's not 25. Put it the other way. And of course, luckily, compulsory school laws and child labor laws are cutting down on the number of children who are working, but there are still children of 10 years and older who are being counted as part of the workforce who were working prior to the Great Depression, believe it or not. So there is that. So that's a huge consequence. High unemployment rates in cities in particular. There are certain pockets of cities where you have unemployment rates as high as about 70%. because the steel mills have closed in Pittsburgh, because the automobile plants in Detroit have closed, because the meatpacking plants in Chicago, there are more workers than there are, people need to eat, so they're not closed, but there are more workers than needed. So people are working underemployed. And when you account for the underemployment rate, when you combine unemployment with underemployment, the underemployment slash unemployment rate in the country by the time you hit the end of 1932 is about 70%. More than two out of every three people who could be in the workforce are either not working at all or working lesser hours and for lower pay. So there's that. And the consequence of that was tremendous. It was absolutely tremendous. More violence broke out. A lot of murder suicides where the husband, the one breadwinner family, killed the wife, killed himself, right? Very narcissistic, but that's pretty much the way this country's always been. Um, More violent crime in terms of robbing banks. I mean, I'm pretty sure you've heard of folks like Pretty Boy Floyd and John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde and all these other folks who were cheered at movie theaters for the few who could afford to still spend 5 cents to go see a movie, who cheered when they saw the newsreels of these folks robbing banks in Illinois and St. Louis and in Texas and in other parts of the country. They were cheered at these places, right? People were so radicalized in some cases that they joined the Communist Party USA or they joined the Socialist Party USA. Their memberships basically, which had been minimal during the 1920s, by the early 1930s, as many as 500,000 people counted themselves as members of the Communist Party USA. And the Socialist Party had even more members. And there is a difference between these two parties of probably upwards of 1.5 million people. Lucille Ball at one point was hauled before a committee in the 1950s for having once been a card-carrying member of the Socialist Party back in the 1930s. That's to give you some idea of what we're talking about here in terms of people, and people being driven into doing things they don't normally do. Black and white farmers trying to unionize in Alabama and Mississippi and other parts of the segregated South. Sharecroppers unions tried to pop up in the 1930s as well. Unions popped up in general too. The CIO popped up as an alternative to the AFL in the 1930s, the Congress of Industrial or basically Congress of Industrial or Organized Labor, right? So unskilled workers finally took the fore, right? And unlike the AFL, they unionized black and white union members together, right? Because things were so desperate. Those are consequences of the Great Depression. One other consequence, which we'll talk about more in week 7 and 8, is that led to World War II. The great, people talk about, well, World War II is because of Hitler. Well, Hitler wouldn't have risen without the Great Depression. Mussolini would have been able to be seen as this prosperous kind of fascist without the Great Depression. The rise of an American Nazi Party in the 1930s and other conservative parties, well, conservative, that's putting it mildly, far-right parties in the 1930s were a consequence of the Great Depression. Without the Great Depression, these things do not occur. And without the Great Depression, there is no World War II. It's a trigger. It's the biggest trigger. Yeah, you can blame the Treaty of Versailles and all of that. You can blame, Hitler and anti-Semitism and eugenics movement and all of that. But you need a catalyst, and the Great Depression was the ultimate catalyst. When 30% of all workers in most of the industrialized nations in the world are out of work, at least 30%. Some places as high as 40%. When so many people are out of work, they're desperate. They want to eat and they can't eat because they don't have the money to eat. They can't stay in the place because they've been rendered homeless and they're looking for work across the countryside. You've got Hooverville set up on the National Mall, Washington D.C. You've got the bonus army, people who were forced to wait for their bonus money from Congress until 1945 because Congress passed an act in 1923 saying you're not getting your 300 some odd dollars of bonus money until 1945. They marched on Washington, 20,000 of them, and were burned out by no other than Douglas MacArthur as General of the Army in Washington, D.C. when he brought flamethrowers and tanks into the National Mall and along the shores of Potomac to burn out Hoovervilles, put so much tear gas out to disperse the crowd that it ended up killing a baby in Washington, D.C., and made hundreds sick, hundreds of Washington, D.C. residents sick, right? Which basically cost her, was Herbert Hoover's response to the Great Depression was terrible, but that's what ultimately cost him his election, because of that image. The image in the newspapers across the country of that was just too great. Those are all consequences of the Depression. And FDR comes into the fold and puts together a New Deal. And that New Deal includes things like trying to put more money toward businesses, basically, businesses too big to fail, particularly banks, calling a 100-day bank holiday. Banks would not open. Stock market was closed for a week so that they could reorganize things and back people's deposits with the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporations, to make sure that banks remain stable and people would still have access to their money. That's what they had to do. But none of the initial things to put people back to work and help really did much. So, and with so much of the country radicalized, particularly on the left, right? President responded to a proposal from Frances Perkins, the first woman cabinet member who's the Secretary of Labor. And she came up with the idea of what we now call the Social Security Act, right? The Social Security Act, which created Social Security. Everyone thinks of Social Security as just simply retirement accounts. It came with that, but it also came with things like workers' compensation. For if someone was injured on the job, they could get workers' comp. It came with unemployment insurance so that if people were out of work, they could get some money so that they could eat and pay rent, and so that they weren't made hobos or made homeless or would feel like killing their wife and their kids and themselves, or abandon their children in the case of. And for those women who were abandoned by their husbands, and that's literally how they thought about the law, came the creation of what's known the aid to dependent children, not the aid to families with dependent children. That title comes later, but the aid to dependent children, so that those housewives could be able to feed their kids and have a roof over their heads while trying to get through the greatest calamity economically in American history. There are 5 facets to this. This. There are a host of workers left out. Some of the legislation that made up the Social Security Act of 1935 is certainly racist, right? Sharecroppers, for instance, weren't allowed to collect unemployment because they fell in a different category. And Southern Democrats would not support the Social Security Act of 1935 without that clause, even though that meant that also millions of poor whites didn't get unemployment either, because the majority of sharecroppers are actually poor Southern white folks, right? 2/3 of them. But making sure that that large 1/3 of African Americans didn't get it was really the goal of Southern Democrats, who didn't want to see the Social Security Act pass at all. So there is that. Um, there's also you know, in addition to that comes the Wagner Act, right? Section 7A of the Wagner Act specifically allows for unions to unionize legally in the United States without the coercion and interference of management, which had been going, management had interfering with whatever unions had existed before 1935, but created a national creation of the Wagner Act and the National Labor Relations Board to go with it allowed for more striking and allowed for workers to fight for things like the 8-hour workday, which eventually Congress passes in 1938. The 40-hour, 8-hour day, 40-hour week, 5-day work week, the minimum wage, all that comes out of the efforts of labor, lobbying Congress and lobbying the president. So a lot happens in the 1930s, some good, a lot bad, but some good in terms of creating the social welfare state that helped catalyze the creation of the American middle class in the first place. And that is where I will end today. So, because I don't want to go longer, and that will be for this week. I will do more on World War II and its connections to the Great Depression for week 7 next week.